Honestly, there are 7 people I have never and will never forgive. Not just for one thing, but for a long chain of betrayals. They know exactly who they are, and so do I.
The world saw them as 4 brothers, a single unit that laughed, played, and conquered the world. They were the Fab Four, the inseparable friends from Liverpool who changed music forever. Their story was a myth of perfect harmony, of 4 personalities, merging into one glorious sound. But behind the beaming smiles and the sellout crowds, a bitter and complex conflict was tearing the band apart. This wasn't just a story of 4 best friends. It was a story of a rigid hierarchy, of genius being stifled, and of a brotherhood strained to its breaking point. At the heart of this conflict were 2 men, Paul McCartney, the charming, prodigiously talented leader, and George Harrison, the quiet, watchful guitarist. For years, George stood in the shadow of the colossal partnership of Lennon and McCartney, his own burgeoning talent often dismissed. It was a dynamic that would breed a resentment so deep it would follow them for decades. This is the story of how Paul McCartney's dominance pushed the quiet Beatle to his limit, and why, years later, George Harrison would make a startling confession about how Paul had impacted his confidence as a musician. The image is iconic: 4 young men, bowing in unison, their faces alight with joy and success. They were a team, the ultimate story of friendship. But that image, like so much in the Beatles' mythology, was only part of the truth. The reality was a cauldron of ego, ambition, and artistic frustration. While John and Paul formed the band's creative nucleus, George Harrison often found himself on the outside looking in, a junior partner in the biggest band in the world. He was the little brother who had to fight for every scrap of creative recognition, and the person he clashed with most often was Paul McCartney. Theirs was a relationship defined by a quiet power struggle that planted the seeds of the band's destruction long before the world knew anything was wrong. To understand the friction, you have to go back to the very beginning. Their relationship didn't start with animosity. It began in friendship on a school bus. Paul, a year older, was charismatic and confident, while George was the younger, guitar-obsessed kid who followed him around. It was Paul who, impressed by George's surprisingly advanced guitar skills, introduced the 14-year-old Harrison to John Lennon, lobbying for his inclusion in their early band, the Quarrymen. In those early days, the age difference mattered. Paul and John were the natural leaders, while George was the talented but junior addition, the kid brother who had to prove his worth. This dynamic was cemented when John and Paul began writing songs together. The Lennon-McCartney partnership became the engine of the band, an exclusive collaboration that instantly created a 2-tiered system. George's role as lead guitarist was crucial. His inventive licks were an essential ingredient in the Beatles' sound. But it was, by nature, a supporting role. He was there to embellish the songs that John and Paul wrote. During their grueling residencies in Hamburg, playing for hours every night, they forged an inseparable bond. But even then, the pecking order was clear. John and Paul commanded the center of the stage. George, quiet and observant, absorbed it all, honing his craft not just as a guitarist, but as a musician with his own voice. It wasn't a malicious hierarchy, at least not at first. Bob Dylan, a friend and observer, would later comment on this, noting that George got stuck having to fight for his space and that he could have been just as big as anybody in his own group. But within the Beatles, he was locked into a role he was quickly outgrowing. When Beatlemania exploded, the pressure to produce hits was immense, and the Lennon-McCartney songwriting machine went into overdrive. For George, this creative torrent was both inspiring and suffocating. He began to write his own songs, starting with Don't Bother Me on With the Beatles. It showed promise, but it was just one track on an album dominated by Lennon and McCartney. This became a recurring pattern. As the band progressed, George's songwriting talent grew exponentially, but the space for him on their records did not. He was typically granted 1 or 2 songs per album, a frustratingly small platform. The frustration was palpable. He famously lamented that getting a song on an album was a monumental struggle. He felt his compositions weren't given the same time or respect as those of his bandmates. In his own band, he was the opening act. Looking back at albums like Help and Rubber Soul, you can trace his evolution. Songs like I Need You and If I Needed Someone showed his growing confidence. By Rubber Soul, his songwriting was arguably on par with some of his bandmates' contributions, yet he still felt like he was fighting for scraps. His wife at the time, Patty Boyd, recalled how George would come home from recording sessions, filled with anger, feeling he was viciously pushed into the background. From Paul's perspective, the situation was more complex. He was a force of nature, overflowing with musical ideas and tasked with keeping the hit machine running. Paul's focus was on creating the best possible Beatles record, and in his mind, that meant using the material he believed to be strongest, which was often his own. However, this unshakable self-belief often came across as patronizing. While John Lennon could be sharp and cynical, it was Paul's confident, almost cheerful, dominance that seemed to grate on George the most. The Lennon-McCartney partnership had become a closed shop, and George was increasingly resentful of his position on the outside. The turning point, where quiet frustration began to morph into open conflict, came during the band's experimental studio years. The 1966 album, Revolver, was a massive leap forward for Harisson as a songwriter. He contributed 3 masterful and distinct tracks, Taxman, Love You Too, and I Want to Tell You. He was no longer just a good guitarist. He was an innovative songwriter. Yet, the old dynamic persisted. The studio, which should have been a collaborative space, often became a battleground for creative control, with Paul frequently at the helm. McCartney had a clear vision for his songs and often dictated what he wanted each member to play. While his instincts were often brilliant, this approach left little room for others to contribute their own ideas. Ringo Starr felt this on his drum parts, but George, an accomplished guitarist, found it particularly insulting. This came to a head during the recording of Hey Jude. As Paul worked through the song on the piano, George tried to add guitar licks to echo the vocal phrases. Paul immediately shut him down, as it wasn't part of his arrangement. To George, it was another instance of being treated like a session musician rather than a creative partner. It was this pattern of behavior that led to one of Harrison's most revealing statements. In a 1974 interview, he confessed, "I had no confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul McCartney. He ruined me as a guitar player." What he meant was that McCartney's overbearing nature and prescriptive arrangements had stifled his ability to play spontaneously within the Beatles. Paul didn't want a collaborator on guitar. He wanted an executor of his ideas. For a musician, as proud as George, this was a profound invalidation of his artistry. By 1968, the cracks in the facade were beginning to show. The sessions for the White Album were notoriously fractured, with the band often sounding like 4 solo artists. Ironically, this atmosphere gave George his most creative freedom yet. He emerged with 4 of his strongest compositions, Piggies, Long, 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 Savoy Truffle, and his signature anthem, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. The story behind While My Guitar Gently Weeps is telling. George struggled to get the others to take the song seriously. Frustrated but sure he had a masterpiece, he made a bold move. He brought his close friend, the revered guitarist Eric Clapton, into the studio. Clapton was hesitant, famously saying, "Nobody ever plays on Beatles records." But George insisted. With Clapton in the room, the others were suddenly on their best behavior. The presence of an outsider forced them to engage respectfully. Clapton's searing solo elevated the track. A few days later, on January 10, 1969, after another argument with Paul, George quietly announced, "I think I'll be leaving the band now." He walked out and went home. That same day, he channeled his frustration into a new song he called Wah Wah. In his autobiography, he explained the title referred to the throbbing headache he got from the endless arguments. It was a roaring blast of sound, a musical declaration of independence. George had quit the Beatles, and it was his toxic dynamic with Paul that pushed him over the edge. Although George was coaxed back into the band, the damage was done. They would come together one last time for Abbey Road, but the spirit was broken. When the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, it was the end of a painful chapter for George Harrison. His creative liberation was spectacular. In late 1970, he released All Things Must Pass, a sprawling triple album of songs he had stockpiled for years, many of which had been overlooked by the Beatles. It was a massive success, proving he was a major artistic force in his own right. But success didn't erase the bitterness. In 1971, George played slide guitar on John Lennon's How Do You Sleep, a vicious musical attack on Paul McCartney. George's presence on the track was a clear statement of where his loyalties lay at that moment. Years later, Harrison would admit he enjoyed being on that side of the fight rather than on the receiving end. It was an act born of years of simmering anger, demonstrating how deep the wounds were. Throughout the 70s and 80s, George was often the most candid about the internal strife. When asked in an interview about working with Paul again, he was blunt. "I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but I would not join a band with Paul McCartney." The power dynamics of their youth had left scars that were slow to heal. The feud was not eternal. The death of John Lennon in 1980 was a shock that forced the surviving members to reevaluate their relationships. While the bitterness never completely vanished, the outright hostility softened. They worked together again on the Anthology project in the mid-1990s, though old tensions occasionally bubbled to the surface. In the final years of George Harrison's life, as he battled cancer, lasting peace was found. Paul McCartney visited his old friend shortly before his passing in 2001. Paul later spoke movingly about that last meeting, describing how the two old friends, who had known each other since they were schoolboys, simply held hands. "I've never held his hand before," Paul recalled, noting how George, even then, just stroked his hand with his thumb. In that quiet room, they weren't icons or rivals. They were just two boys from Liverpool. The relationship between George Harrison and Paul McCartney was a paradox. It was a brotherhood forged in fame, yet strained by ego and creative jealousy. The very forces that made the Beatles magnificent were also what tore them apart. The animosity was real, a palpable bitterness that colored much of George's life. But beneath it all, there was a bond that could never be completely broken. In the end, the love, however complicated, was as real as the frustration.